So this September, me and my wife will have been married for 3 years, which is awesome. My wife, Julie. Nothing special about 3 years. I'm just glad we're still married and that we got married and all that good stuff. Especially when you know how long it took me to ask her out. It took me over a year to finally ask her out on our first date, partially because I was nervous and partially because I'm an idiot. And so most of the men in the room probably dealt with that. But I was nervous because we had like some similar friend groups, and if it didn't work out, I didn't want it to get weird. But even more so, I knew she was incredible. I knew she was amazing, and I was like afraid that it was gonna work out. Like I was afraid, like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna date her and never date anyone and get married. That's terrifying, you know? And so all this was kind of playing into it. But we would kind of hang out. We had different friend groups we hang out with, and then we would kind of text. Then I'd get nervous and back away. And then, we would talk a little bit more and text more. Then I get nervous and I'd back away. And she was pretty much done with Sam, okay? That's what I call myself when I talk to myself in the third person. And so, you don't do that? So she was over it, But I finally get around to asking her out on a date, and she says yes. And I don't know that any of this is going. I'm oblivious. So we get on our first date, and I'm expecting this to go like any first date would go. It's fun, it's flirty, it's nothing serious. You might get dessert, and it's just kind of chill, And you get into the serious stuff later. So we're sitting there at dinner, and I decide to make a comment along the lines of, hey, finally on a date, long time coming, am I right? And she looks at me, and she puts her fork down, and she said, yeah, so what took you so long to ask me out? I was like, you're not laughing. She was dead serious, So for the next 25 minutes, I'm over here trying to explain all that was going on and why it took me forever, hoping, A, that she would stay until I paid for the check and that we would get to go on date number 2. I had one expectation, I had some expectations how the date was gonna go, and she had some completely other expectations of how the date was going to go. She was right, and she won. But she needed to know that I wasn't just messing around. But expectations, we all have them, right? Expectations, a strong belief that something will happen, a strong belief about how it will happen, a strong belief about when it will happen. We've all got them. And we've got like the normal expectations, like you order something on Amazon Prime, you expect 2-day shipping, right? If not, you're making a phone call to Amazon customer service, When I walk into a public building, I expect there to be Wi-Fi. It's 2018, people. This should not be that difficult. You know what I'm saying? But the expectations that I want to talk about today are a little bit more specific. I want to talk about relational expectations, specifically the expectations that we place on other people. Now, before I go any further, let me just be really, really clear to all the single ladies in the house and all the desperate fellas sitting in the room today, okay? This is not a marriage talk because expectations are not marriage specific. In fact, we've got expectations in any and all the relationships that we have. Like, yes, you've got expectations for your spouse, but you've also got expectations for the people that you date. You've got expectations for your friends, for your neighbors. You've got expectations for your coworkers and for your employees. You've got expectations for your parents, for your brother, your sister. You've got expectations for your roommates. And if you've ever had an expectation for someone, which you're human, which means you have, then here's what's also true. You've experienced the frustration of unmet expectations. And isn't it so true, if we could just get real for just a minute, isn't it so true that unmet expectations are often the source of frustrations in some of our relationships? Like, isn't it so true that unmet expectations lead to conflict and tension in so many of our relationships? That unmet expectations are what robs a friendship of joy, a workplace of joy and productivity, and even a relationship of love? And whenever our expectations go unmet, guess whose fault it never is? Ours, It's always on them. Our immediate thought is, well, if he would have just, if she would just. When we think about unmet expectations, it's always their fault. And to us, it's so simple. Just do what I expect. But what if? What if our unmet expectations have more to do with us poorly managing them than it has to do with the person actually meeting them? See, because here's what I know is true about me, and I would imagine it's probably true about you too, is that we tend to be poor managers of the expectations that we place on others. We tend to be poor managers of the expectations that we place on other people. And usually there's 3 characteristics of poorly managed expectations that we place on others. One of them being that poorly managed expectations are often assumed rather than communicated. That poorly managed expectations tend to be unfair, unrealistic, or unreasonable. And then poorly managed expectations tend to breed bitterness, they create distance between two people, and they often erode trust. In fact, unmet expectations, poorly managed expectations, have far more negative impact on our relationships than maybe you've ever realized. But I believe that poorly managed expectations are the silent killers of healthy relationships. That there are these things, we think about all the things that we want and all the things that we need from somebody else. And without even realizing, we're slowly deteriorating the relationship. And let me just kind of prove it to you. There's a study done about the different emotions that are kind of felt whenever expectations go unmet. The emotions that are felt on both sides of the equation whenever expectations are managed poorly. And if you're on the side of the equation where your expectations are not met by somebody else, one of the emotions you might feel is anger. Why won't you just do what I want? Or if you're on the side of your expectations not being met, you might feel sadness. Well, if he really loved me, he would just do what I wanted. But then there's the other side. If you're the person who cannot meet the expectations of somebody else, you might feel anxiety. I just don't know. I just don't know what to do to make her happy. Or if you're on the side of not living up to someone else's expectations, you might experience shame. It doesn't matter what I do, I'm never going to be good enough for him. And in no world, in no scenario, in no relationship where anger, sadness, anxiety, and shame live, can there be a healthy, working, functional relationship. So what do we do? How can we get better at managing our expectations to avoid these silent killers in our relationships? Well, the Apostle Paul, he gives us an idea in Philippians chapter 2. And here he's talking about how we are to relate to other people. And he says this in Philippians verse 3. Do nothing, he says. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Now, he's not talking specifically about expectations here. He's talking about our selfishness in relationships in general. But isn't it so true? Have you ever noticed? Expectations, they're selfish little creatures. I mean, expectations begin with us and serve us because expectations are all about what we want, when we want it, and how we want it. In fact, if we're being totally honest, most of our expectations that we place on others begin with some kind of hope or some kind of desire, and we just decide to throw it on the other person. But what Paul would say is that we would do nothing in our relationships out of selfish ambition or empty glory or vain conceit. And so maybe one of the biggest revelations you might have this morning is that maybe your expectations and maybe my expectations can actually be selfish ambition. And then he goes on, he says this in verse 4, rather in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but to the interests of others. That you wouldn't just think about all that you want, but you would actually think about the person on the other side of the equation. Here he tells us how to view people and then how to relate to them. Well, how do we view them? Well, we need to value them above ourselves. And then how do we treat them? How do we relate to them? We would be willing to put their interests before our own. Call me crazy, but whenever I'm thinking about all that I want and all that I expect, it's not very often that I'm thinking about the interests of another. And then he goes on and he ends this little passage here and he says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. Have the same outlook when you look at the other person, and when you look at the other person and your expectations through the lens that Jesus looked at, that we would model the way that we treat them the way that Jesus did. Jesus, who did not come to be served, but to serve. Jesus, who was more about giving than he was about getting. So what does that mean? Do we just need to never have expectations again? Do we just need to set the bar so low that we're always impressed? Husbands are currently nodding their heads. No, I think what we learn here is when we look at our expectations through the lens of humility and valuing others more than we value ourselves, we'll actually learn 3 things that can help us be better managers of our expectations. And the first one is this: express what's expected. Who would have thought actually communicating what you expect, it'll do wonders for your relationship? Actually express what you expect. Isn't it so true that in moments when you don't want to express your expectations, pride is whispering in the very back of your mind, you shouldn't have to say anything, they should know. You don't have to tell them, she should know better. Oh, well, if he really cares about his job, you don't have to tell him, he should know. If she really loves you, you don't have to tell her, she should know. It's pride whispering in the back of our minds. Somewhere along the lines, we've bought into the lie that if you really love someone, you can read their minds. That if you want to be a great employee, that they can just read your mind. That great roommates can just read your mind. But it's pride. And so through the perspective of humility, we don't let pride keep us from expressing what we expect. We express what we expect. And then that kind of leads into the second one, that we need to be willing to adjust what's unfair, unrealistic, or unreasonable. Did you know that your expectations could be described in such a way? Unfair, unrealistic, and unreasonable. That you have to invite the other person into the conversation. That when you're willing to put their interests before your own, you give them space to speak into, this is huge, to speak into the expectations that you've placed on them. You create room for negotiation. Because here's the deal. People have capacities and people have limits. And when we don't allow them to speak into the expectations that we place on them, we're living in this all or nothing world that rarely benefits anybody. And so to value the other person, we give them space to speak into the expectations that we have. And then in our humility and in hopes in an attempt to value them, we'd be willing to adjust what's unfair, unrealistic, and unreasonable. And then the last one is this, that we would forgive when he or she fails. Because he will fail, and she will fail, and you will fail. And it does not matter how much you adjust. It does not matter how much you express. There will be failure. But there is no place for anger or frustration or bitterness or shame to live in a relationship where forgiveness is present. And if I could just be real, for the Jesus follower in the room, this is a non-negotiable. Because for the Jesus follower in the room, how dare we withhold forgiveness from others that our Heavenly Father through Jesus so lavishly bestowed upon us. So how can we be better managers of our expectations? Just remember, express them, adjust them. You gotta be willing to forgive them. If you wanna be a better leader, if you wanna be a better husband, if you want healthier work relationships, if you wanna be a better parent and a better roommate and a better fiance and a better friend, just remember, when it comes to your expectations, express them, adjust them, and be willing to forgive them. Thanks.